Hey guys, welcome back to a Summary of Ecclesiastes. If you're enjoying this content, just remember, like, subscribe, those things mean a lot to the channel. Helps us kind of get our name out there, helps the algorithm pick up and help more people find this content. Also, I'm going to ask you to comment if you have a side note that you want me to do, whether it's further information on a topic, whether it's more, where'd you get that research, things like that. I'd be glad to do little side notes. Some of them are already planned. You can kind of look at the channel and see some of the ones that are already put in place. But if you request one and I decide to do it, I will just add it there to the playlist and you can go follow up. I'll try to put a comment to let you know that I've done it. There's going to be a side note on some of these. You'll see this lesson right here is talking about David. The next lesson is going to talk a little bit more about Solomon's reign itself. And I want you to follow up because the side note is actually a comic series that covers this content put out by a group called Brainy Pixel. And so you guys can follow up with that on the side note. I'm not going to talk about it in the main video, but I'll throw it there in the side note so that you guys can go see a quick summary and a little bit of what's going on in that content. I didn't show too much of the comic because I don't want to ruin it for you in case you don't know how the story ends. Anyway, there's a lot going on. And so again, if you want to help out a good Christian publishing group that just does all sorts of work, and if you want to get a little bit more information that's kid-friendly, then check it out. I know sometimes when you read Bible stories, you're like, those aren't exactly kid-friendly. Yeah, I know. And so let's dig in to the life of Solomon, the life of David. We'll kind of see some of the roots of where a lot of this stuff comes from. Because as you study through Solomon and Ecclesiastes, you start seeing, oh, I think he might be referencing this story, or he might be referencing this account. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. He doesn't name names. But again, if you understand some of the struggles he went through, then you'll probably appreciate a little bit more some of the stuff going on behind the scenes. Now, like I said at the end of the last lesson, Solomon is looking at a lot of things in life, and he's noticing these apparent contradictions. Now, we'll probably end up doing a side note on this, but the apparent contradictions come from a misunderstanding of how wisdom literature works. So again, you'll probably see this slide again. Check the side notes. You might see some of that information. But there's these apparent contradictions when the Bible says this is how it's going to work, and then it doesn't necessarily work like that. And so what he's trying to do is he's trying to unpack that in his head, make sense of it. Now remember, he's the one who wrote Proverbs. He's the one who also looks at it and goes, but that doesn't always work. So he's not contradicting. He's expounding and going, I want to fully understand what's going on here. So Solomon, he's trying to express through an apparent contradiction the fact that anything sought for outside the provision of God, and if you're trying to find all of your meaning in that, it's going to be as fleeting as vapor and about as pleasurable as chasing the wind. That's going to bring up a few terms. We're not going to get into the terms right now. Okay, but Solomon is going to repeat a few terms over and over and over again, and that's where this fleeting as vapor and pleasurable as chasing the wind comes into play. Those three words right there that are underlined are all going to have some key words that you're going to see as we go further in the text. However, we do want to dig into the life of David. So, here's the necessary backstory that you need to understand. Solomon is the son of David. Now, he's not the eldest son. That's actually part of how Solomon gets into the kingdom. It's a very sordid story. But David starts off, he's pretty much a nobody. He's a shepherd off in the backfield. He's got a bunch of older brothers who don't treat him with any respect. And so you can kind of see this is where David comes from. Solomon's going to talk about this person who comes from nowhere and comes to reign. That's pretty much the life of his father. And Saul, on the other hand, is someone who is an old king who will no more be admonished. You can kind of see where Solomon would have gotten some of those points. Now, again, David is going to have a lot of situations. Here's him killing Goliath. But he's got a lot more that goes on in his life. And so between 1st and 2nd Samuel, some of the Chronicles, some of Kings, you're going to have a lot of this information is going to come from about those 6 books. You're going to have a whole bunch of stuff. David wrote a lot of the Psalms, so you're going to have a lot of information coming out of there. And David is going to be unbelievably important to pretty much any king after him, because he is the litmus test of did they follow and walk in the ways of David or not. And that's really going to be the standard that God sets up. David's going to do a lot of things that God basically says, because you chose to honor me in this way, I am going to choose to make you a house. And so some of the things that God puts up with in the life of Solomon are seemingly out of respect for David, his servant, and the promises that he makes to him. Again, First Kings covers the death of David, reign of Solomon, and so if you really want to kind of see the end of David's life, the start of Solomon's reign, First Kings, the beginning there is going to be where you go. So again, we're moving pretty quickly through this material. Now, one thing you want to note, and I covered this early on, where we take the Bible for what it means, not necessarily always specifically the words that are using. Okay, as you compare First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, you're going to find some different accounts of the same stories. A lot of people scream that they're contradictions. I think looking at them, you're actually going to find that it's more of a different focus. And so there are times where Solomon's idolatry is really going to be focused on. There's going to be times where it's completely ignored. It's because the focus of the story is different, so you don't need to include all the details. Just in a general sense, there are some other supposed contradictions. And to understand those, I've started a series called Those So-Called Errors. And the so-called errors actually comes from this book right here, written by Chet Koulis. Chet Koulis has done a lot of research trying to compare all the different accounts. And what he does is he realizes basically there are no contradictions. These numbers are different, but they're different for a specific reason. So we're not getting into any of that. If you wish to further your education, again, Those So-Called Errors is the name of the book. And it comes at it from a strictly, this is what the Bible says. Let's not worry about trying to go to scribal errors or anything like that. Let's take it as if this is exactly what it was supposed to say. How do you explain it? And I think that's a really powerful approach, and he does a good job of it. So if you're looking specifically at some of the contradictions with First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, this is going to be the book you want to go to on that resource. Now, we're not dealing with a lot of that stuff. Like I said, we're dealing with David's life. Now, David is going to rise to notoriety after the death of Goliath. He's going to come into Saul's retinue. He's going to become a man of war and really, really excel in that department. That's going to come into play later. He's also going to be a man, a musical man. Really, really into music. Really, really into soothing Saul's heart with the power of good music. And that's going to be the value. David's going to work his way into the kingdom through that. It's funny because at the end of David's life, one of the things that's going to be said about him is that he is the sweet psalmist of the Lord. It doesn't bring up most of his other accomplishments, brings up a whole bunch about his mighty men, but David's music is the major thing that he's remembered for, biblically speaking. His reign, he'll actually reign from a place called Hebron for a while. Eventually he'll take over the whole kingdom, and so that's how David works. His reign is not across the whole country. It's a chunk, and then that chunk expands out. He becomes the ideal king. All of these kings are going to reference back to David in some way or another. Does not mean he was sinless, does not mean he was perfect, does not mean he had no flaws. But again, his heart is right with God, because even in spite of his flaws, David is still going to come, and he is going to be a man who seeks after God, who seeks after godly things, and this is a man who really just becomes that ideal king for those reasons. Again, every king after him is going to be compared in some way or another based on the heart attitude. You'll notice David and Saul are the two kings that don't struggle with idolatry. Saul does a lot to tear it down. David never struggles with it once. And after David, there's just struggle after struggle after struggle, because their heart is not perfect. There's always something lacking. But David's heart was perfect. Again, not sinless, but as far as his commitment to God and God alone as king, as God of Israel, it was perfect. And that's why he was a man after God's own heart. Again, just to kind of take that into perspective with David. Now, David is going to sin. I trust, if there's two stories everybody knows about David and Goliath, David and Bathsheba, the two giants. He beats one and he falls prey to the other. David's mighty men, he has a counselor named Ahithophel. Ahithophel has a granddaughter named Bathsheba, who is the wife of another one of David's mighty men named Uriah. David commits adultery. Then he commits murder to cover it up. And so this is a really big deal. This one action, if you can understand this pivotal moment in David's life, this is going to be the key moment in Solomon coming to the throne. Mainly because Bathsheba's his mom and David's his dad. So that's one of the main crucial points. But this is also going to set the stage, I believe, for a series of events that removes multiple other children from the picture, and also leaves us with Solomon. And really, it's just God looks at David and says, the sword will not depart from your house. And that promise is kept. And it's heartrending as you read the account. Now, again, Nathan the prophet's going to accuse David of sin in a way that shows David's godliness. He will repent. He will be forgiven. However, the damage has been done, and though the punishment for both adultery and murder is the death penalty, God says, I am going to spare you, but the sword will not depart from your house, and someone will sleep with all your wives in full view in Israel. And so David really receives recompense back on him, like he gets punished sorely. And so I kind of almost look at it and say the death would have been an easier thing to handle. But again, he suffers. Again, much punishment's going to come, and that's what we've got. Now, David is going to reap what he sowed. He's going to take it like a man. He's a godly man. He's going to take the punishment. Others would sleep with his wives. Sword will never depart from his house, and the child who is born will die. And multiple other children of his are going to die as a direct result. Now, you might look at this and say, well, what about Absalom? What about Amnon? You know, how did these play in? I believe some of this plays in because David struggled with a certain sin, and he was afraid to deal with it in the life of his children. And so because of that, it's almost this David scenario where because he didn't want to be a hypocrite, maybe he just didn't pay attention to his kids, he allows certain things to happen and he doesn't discipline them, and that escalates and balloons out of control. And so again, this is the life Solomon is born into. Continuing pretty quickly, I'm obviously not digging in too deep. I want you to kind of summarize, get over it. The next major event in David's life, so you've got the Bathsheba incident. The next major event plays right into this, where the sins of the father are really sins of the children because the proclivities tend to be the same. Tamar and Amnon. Don't need to go into gratuitous detail in this story. You guys know this story. Long story short, Amnon lusts after his sister. It's a gross situation, but Amnon had a friend. You've heard that sermon. If you've heard it once, you've heard it a dozen times. Every preacher comes along and is like, I got an idea for a sermon. Amnon had a friend. And then he preaches the same sermon we heard over and over again. I worked at camp for a long time. I heard that sermon a lot. It's a good sermon, but it's not original by any stretch of the imagination. But what do you have? You've got Amnon, who is taking advantage of a situation totally wrong. He's following in the footsteps of what his father did, and he does it too. Now, that's where Absalom plays in, because David does nothing. David gets angry. He doesn't do anything. And so Absalom determines at that point that he's going to take matters into his own hands, and he does. He gets everyone together. He has a party, and he takes out his brother Amnon. Now, David hears word of this, and David is not willing to put Absalom to death. He wasn't willing to really do anything to Amnon. And so David has mostly neglected his duties as king and as father to take care of these issues. Amnon's now dead, and Absalom, it's exile for him. Well, when we come back, we'll deal with what happened with Absalom, because that's going to lead to a cascading effect that reigns right into Solomon's life, because this is all stuff that David has to deal with. And so, guys, just as you guys understand, as we look at Solomon's life, this is his childhood. This is his growing up period. It's not a pleasant time. He's revolutions and chaos and murder. This is not a pleasant life to start off with. This is not like a cushy prince who's just like, everything's going well for me. This is rough. And so I want you guys to understand that as we look at Solomon's life. And so this is a little bit about David. And again, check out the side note. You'll see more information on some comic stuff with David. And I will catch you guys next time here on the Summer of Ecclesiastes.